In 1992, NASA engineers made a mistake. They were searching for water beneath the sands of the Rub al Khali, but instead, they broke into something ancient. When the drill pierced an underground cavern, it wasn't gas that escaped, but the sweet scent of frankincense. Scientists lowered a microphone, expecting silence. Instead, they heard thousands of human voices screaming in agony. They had found the legendary Atlantis of the sands, a city that didn't collapse, but was buried alive. This is the full story. Deep in the heart of the unforgiving Rub al Khali desert, the sand heats up to the temperature of melting lead. Thousands of years ago, a miracle stood there that defied God himself. This was Ubar, known in the sacred texts as Iram of the Pillars. It was a city the likes of which had not been created in all the lands of the earth. It stood at the vital intersection of the ancient incense trade routes. Every brick in its massive walls was soaked in the heavy aroma of precious frankincense. In those times, this resin was valued far more highly than gold. King Shaddad was blinded by his immeasurable wealth and ambition. He decided to construct a paradise on earth so humans would no longer need to strive for the heavens. He erected towering spires made of pure marble that pierced the shimmering heat. They were encrusted with rubies and pearls that caught the harsh sun. He channeled water through complex canals, which was the greatest luxury in the burning desert. The inhabitants of Ubar, known as the people of Ad, were giants in stature. They were giants not only in their physical size but also in their boundless pride. They looked out at the barren, shifting dunes around them with a deep sense of contempt. They were certain that their wealth and engineering genius made them immortal. They believed they were invulnerable to any threat from enemies or nature. The emptiness of the empty quarter is a silence that screams. It is a place where life usually goes to wither and die under the white sun. Yet in this furnace, a contradiction rose from the dust to challenge the sky. Ubar was not merely a settlement but a declaration of war against the elements. It sat like a jeweled spider at the center of a vast web of commerce. Long lines of camels traversed the dunes to bring the blood of the trees to its gates. This was the frankincense that burned on the altars of Rome and Egypt. The wealth it generated was beyond the comprehension of ordinary men. King Shaddad looked upon his domain and saw no reason to bow to any deity. He possessed the power to command the earth to yield its hidden treasures. He ordered the construction of columns so high they seemed to scrape the stars. These were the pillars that would give the city its legendary name. They were carved with intricate designs that told the history of a people who feared nothing. The water that bubbled in their fountains was drawn from deep beneath the crust. It was pulled from ancient aquifers that had been hidden since the dawn of time. To the Bedouin wandering the wastes, Ubar appeared as a hallucination. It was a shimmering mirage of green and white amidst the endless yellow. But inside the walls, the air was thick with the suffocating weight of hubris. The people of Ad walked with the heavy tread of those who claimed to own the world. They draped their bodies in silks brought from the edges of the known map. They feasted on delicacies transported across the burning sands on ice. They mocked the sun that scorched the skin of lesser men outside their gates. They believed their stone mastery had conquered the chaotic nature of the desert. They did not understand the geology that lay beneath their feet. They did not know that the water they drained was the only thing holding the earth up. Every cup of wine they drank brought the ceiling of the underworld closer to collapse. They were building a monument to eternity on the roof of a sinkhole. The very engineering that gave them life was slowly preparing their grave. They saw only their own reflection in the marble, blind to the abyss below. The desert waited patiently, for it knew that stone is heavy and sand is shifting. Life within the high walls of Ubar was a perpetual carnival of excess. It was a place where the dark of night was forcibly turned into day. Thousands of oil lamps burned with a fragrant, golden glow. They cast long shadows that danced against the marble facades. Wine flowed through the streets like water in the canals. It drowned out the quiet, nagging voice of reason and restraint. The people gorged themselves on the fruits of their immense trade. They believed their pleasure was the only true purpose of existence. They adorned their bodies with jewels that sparkled like captured stars. The sound of music and laughter echoed from the towers. It was a symphony of vanity that reached the ears of the heavens. Into this den of vice walked the solitary figure of the prophet Hud. He was clad in simple wool that contrasted sharply with their silk. He warned them that their pride was a foundation built on shifting sand. He told them they were standing on the precipice of a great abyss. But his grave words were swallowed by the raucous laughter of the giants. They mocked his dire warnings with the loud clinking of gold coins. They pointed to their majestic pillars that pierced the burning heavens. They asked who could possibly possess more power than the people of Ad. They were the conquerors of the wasteland and the masters of the stone. They claimed to be the architects of their own divine destiny. They had forgotten the most terrifying truth of their lavish existence. Their magnificent city did not rest upon the safety of solid bedrock. It stood precariously on a thin, fragile crust of eroding limestone. Beneath their gilded sandals lay a colossal, hollow cavern of darkness. It had been carved out by the very waters they so greedily consumed. Millions of years of subterranean erosion had created a vast void. The water table was the only pillar supporting the weight of the city. As they drained the aquifers to feed their fountains, the support weakened. They were sucking away the pressure that held up the roof of the world. Every drop of water wasted on a garden brought them closer to hell. Their confidence was their most fatal sin against the natural order. They believed they controlled the elements with their engineering. In reality, they were merely dancing on the lid of a giant coffin. The lid was cracking with every step of their heavy, gilded sandals. They celebrated their immortality while hovering over a hungry black pit. The abyss below was waiting patiently for the moment to snap shut. It was a geological trap set by time and triggered by greed. The city was a beautiful parasite killing its own host. The catastrophe did not announce itself with a sudden rain of fire. It did not send a plague of locusts to darken the sky. It began with a silence that was heavier than the desert heat. A strange, low-frequency hum began to rise from the bowels of the earth. It was a vibration that rattled the wine in the golden goblets. It was felt in the teeth before it was heard by the ears. The water in the ancient wells suddenly retreated into the abyss. For centuries, the water had been sweet and clear as crystal. Now it vanished, leaving behind only wet silt and a stench of sulfur. The aroma of frankincense was overpowered by the smell of deep rot. Then the wind arrived, screaming across the open dunes. The sacred texts named this wind the Sasa, the howling gale. It was cold and relentless, stripping the paint from the walls. It carried not the relief of a breeze but a choking dust. The sand scoured the marble streets like millions of glass shards. The sky turned a bruised purple as the storm swallowed the stars. But the residents of Ubar were accustomed to total comfort. They did not fall to their knees in prayer or fear. They simply locked their heavy doors that were plated in gold. They believed they could wait out the storm in luxury. They had weathered the harsh moods of the desert many times. They retreated to their banquet halls and lit thousands of lamps. They ordered the musicians to play louder to drown out the wind. They poured more wine to wash away the unease in their guts. They looked at their strong walls and smiled with arrogance. They did not understand the true nature of the earth's trembling. It was not a simple earthquake shaking their solid foundations. It was the sound of the structural pillars snapping deep below. Their vast underground reservoir had been drained to the last drop. The water that held up the roof of the cavern was gone. The limestone crust was groaning under the immense weight of the city. The towering columns and heavy palaces were too much to bear. Their vibration was the sound of geology finally giving up. Below the marble floors, the darkness was preparing to feed. The people of Ad laughed at the storm raging outside. They felt invincible inside their fortress of wealth and engineering. But their confidence was the final seal on their death warrant. They were standing on a trapdoor that was slowly unlatching. The very ground they claimed to own was about to betray them. They sat in their gilded cages while the floor turned to dust. The physics of their void were about to exact a terrible price. The screaming wind was not an attack, but a funeral dirge. The massive weight of the city pressed down on the thin crust. Cracks began to race through the bedrock unseen by human eyes. The support beams of the earth were splintering one by one. The feast continued above while the grave opened below. In a single second that stretched into an agonizing eternity, the earth beneath Ubar ceased to be a solid foundation. It transformed instantly into a greedy and gaping maw of darkness. A gigantic sinkhole opened directly beneath the city center. It was hundreds of meters wide and impossibly deep. Physics finally arrived to claim its terrible right of vengeance. The towering spires of marble did not crumble or topple sideways. They fell straight down into the abyss in perfect vertical formation. It looked as though toys were being swept off a table by a petulant child. The palaces and the markets were swallowed whole by the sudden void. The lush gardens vanished into the throat of the earth in a heartbeat. The sand of the desert suddenly began to behave like a fluid. It poured into the massive breach like water rushing down a drain. It filled the voids and sealed the city in a tomb of silica. The screams of thousands were silenced instantly by the roar of the collapse. It was the deafening sound of stone snapping and rock grinding. The Atlantis of the sands was buried under meters of shifting dunes. There was no trace left on the surface of its former glory. The lamps that lit the night were extinguished by the rush of earth. The wine goblets were crushed under the weight of falling ceilings. King Shaddad fell from his throne into the suffocating dark. The pillars that scraped the sky became the bars of a sudden prison. The entire civilization was erased from the map in a single breath. The desert reclaimed what had been stolen from it centuries ago. The wind howled over the spot where a city had stood moments before. It smoothed the sand over the grave with a terrifying indifference. The sinkhole consumed the arrogance of the people of Ad. It dragged their achievements down into the cool and damp underworld. The physics of the collapse were brutal and absolute. There was no time for prayer or for bargaining with fate. Gravity pulled the jewels and the bones down together. The earth simply opened its mouth and swallowed the infection. The structural failure was total and catastrophic. The pressure that had been building for eons was finally released. The limestone roof shattered into millions of jagged pieces. The city did not just fall, it was inhaled by the desert. The golden age of Ubar ended not with a war, but with a fall. The silence that followed was heavy and final. The horror for those who survived the initial plunge was beyond description. They did not perish instantly from the violence of the impact. The architecture of Ubar was built to withstand the ages. The massive columns and thick walls held together in the fall. They were preserved in a pocket of air deep underground. But this miracle was actually a curse of prolonged suffering. The magnificent banquet halls had transformed into sealed crypts. They were trapped beneath tons of rock and shifting silica. The darkness was absolute and pressed against their eyes. It was a heavy, suffocating blackness that erased all direction. The dust of pulverized limestone filled the stagnant air. It clogged their throats and coated their lungs with grit. Every breath was a struggle against the choking cloud. They could hear the terrifying sounds of the earth settling. Massive slabs of marble groaned under the immense pressure above. The sound was like the bones of the earth snapping. Sand hissed as it forced its way through the cracks. It poured into the buried chambers like liquid death. It was an hourglass that was counting down their final moments. The golden lamps were extinguished and crushed. The jewels they treasured were now sharp debris underfoot. The ruby necklaces and pearl bracelets were useless trash. They could not trade their vast fortune for a single breath. King Shaddad screamed into the void of his own palace. His voice echoed off the walls of his expensive tomb. The giants of Ad were reduced to clawing, panicked animals. Their size and strength were meaningless in the dark. The heat began to rise as the ventilation was cut off. The air grew heavy with carbon dioxide and fear. They scrambled over one another in a blind frenzy. They tore at the stone walls with their fingernails. They realized that their city had fallen into the underworld. The realization drove them to the brink of total madness. They understood that the desert above had betrayed them. The dunes had smoothed over the scar in the crust. The sun was shining on a pristine landscape above. No one would hear their cries from the deep. They were being erased from the history of the living. Their pride had dug a grave deep enough for a civilization. The punishment was fitting for their monumental arrogance. They were destined to become fossils in a cage of gold. The silence of the grave slowly replaced the screaming. This was a slow and agonizing execution in the deep. The terror was not just physical but deeply psychological. They had believed they were the masters of the earth. Now the earth was digesting them in its stone belly. The intricate canals they built were now dry and broken. The fountains that once sprayed water now sprayed dust. The silk tapestries were buried under piles of rubble. The smell of incense turned into the smell of death. Time lost all meaning in the eternal blackness. Minutes stretched into hours of suffocating dread. They waited for a rescue that would never come. The world above had already forgotten their names. They were merely a layer of sediment in the geological record. The luxury they lived for had become their torture chamber. The gold they hoarded was the only witness to their end. The abyss had swallowed the sin along with the sinner. For thousands of years, the desert kept its dark secret. The wind sculpted the dunes into ever-changing shapes. The grave of the proud people of Ad remained unmarked. But in the year 1992, the sky opened its eyes. Satellites belonging to NASA looked down from the black void. They were equipped with radar capable of seeing through sand. They pierced the dry skin of the empty quarter. They revealed a ghost network of ancient caravan tracks. These invisible roads converged on a single point in the waste. On the surface, there was nothing but endless yellow sand. But the radar saw the skeleton of a metropolis below. An expedition of scientists and explorers raced to the coordinates. They brought heavy machinery to battle the deep dunes. They began to peel back the layers of history. Soon, their shovels struck something hard and white. It was the top of a marble pillar preserved in the sand. The legend of Iram was no longer a myth. They had found the spires that once challenged the heavens. The deeper they dug, the more the horror was revealed. They were not uncovering ruins weathered by the wind. They were finding a city frozen in the exact moment of death. It was like a prehistoric insect trapped in golden amber. The ground-penetrating radar showed massive anomalies. There were colossal voids beneath the crust of the desert. The city had not been destroyed by an invading army. It had simply dropped into a pocket of the underworld. The towers were standing upright in the deep dark. The archaeologists prepared a drill to pierce the chamber. They bored through the capstone that sealed the tomb. When the drill broke through, a gust of wind escaped. It was air that had been trapped for thousands of years. The scientists leaned in, expecting the smell of stale dust. But the air did not smell of decay or dry earth. It carried the heavy, sweet scent of frankincense. It was the aroma of the last feast of King Shaddad. It was mixed with the cold, metallic scent of terror. The team lowered sensitive microphones down the narrow shaft. They expected to hear the shifting of rocks or silence. Instead, their headphones filled with a terrifying sound. It was a distorted, low-frequency hum rising from the deep. The audio engineers filtered the noise to clear the static. The color drained from their faces as they listened. It was not the sound of wind moving through the caverns. It was the cacophony of thousands of human voices. They were screaming in a dialect that had been dead for eons. The sound was a loop of eternal agony and panic. The city was not just a ruin, it was a prison. The people of Ad had been swallowed by the earth alive. Their final moments were echoing in the dark forever. The scientists pulled the microphone up in pure horror. They realized they had not found an archaeological site. They had drilled a hole into the ceiling of hell. The desert kept its promise to bury the sinners. The screaming continues beneath the sand of the empty quarter.